Hello, my name is TrainMaster04, and in this video I'll be talking about weathering. More specifically, how I have weathered my locomotives and rolling stock. So what is weathering? Essentially what weathering is basically turning a simple car like so. As you can see on this side, it is completely normal, and turning it into a worn down piece of equipment. In this case, this has been really heavily weathered and will be one of the cars we'll be looking at shortly. And weathering itself can be done by using many different types of techniques, and really the kind of technique that I'll be showing you today may or may not work for you, and instead you may find something else that better suits you. Now, some of those techniques are such as dry brush weathering, which I'll be talking about today, using an airbrush, or even using some form of chalk or dry paint. A lot of hobbyists that I've seen have gone towards the dry brush weathering or even chalks because it gives that natural foggy sensation. However, with dry brush weathering, what I like to do with it is having control. Control of being able to physically work in the patina that is produced on the side of the car, and also, more importantly, being able to fix if I make a mistake. So let's get into the kind of materials we'll be using for today. The materials typically used is a set of paint brushes. In this case, we'll either be using the heavy gauge or medium gauged paintbrush. It may be a bit of the small one to get a few smaller areas. For the base paint, what I typically use is an acrylic earth brown tone. In this case, you can get this at a local hobby shop like Hobby Lobby, Michael's, anywhere that you can get it. In this case, I got it this big bottle for $4.50 at Hobby Lobby. And that brown paint itself, as I say, as a base tone, is to give the model the rough, rusty look. To give out some of the highlights, such as dust or what you typically see when a locomotive or a boxcar goes through white powdery dust, fine dust, or even goes through a wash or has leakage, I use a simple bottle of white paint. Nothing much, but a lot goes a long way, and in this case, it really brings out some nice little details. And finally, since my railroad has a lot of tunnels and also runs a lot of steam locomotives, I use a black paint. In this case, it is a lamp black paint, and this also does go a long way as well. With that being said, you may be wondering, what in the world can you weather, and how is the best way to weather them? So to start off, let's first get a paper towel laid down so that our test car can be rested on and we don't get any paint on my desk. But basically, you can weather anything from buildings, cars, and even locomotives. In the car's case, as you can see, it has a mixture of both rust, since this is a silver box car, and also a bit of coal dust. Now, most of the areas that you'll see weathering are raised spots, such as rivets, ladder stanchions, and anywhere that has some prominent area. In this case, if you didn't want to weather your vehicle or your building, car, whatnot, in a heavy manner, what you would do is instead weather along the edges, just lightly feathering the edges themselves, oh so lightly, and maybe spilling over onto the main panels. The idea is basically that any dirt, grime, and whatnot gets kicked up by the wheels and the motion of the train, sticks onto the surface, and stays there. Over time, it may build up, and if the boxcar or locomotive is really old, then you may go and do a heavy weathering like I did here. But besides that, another area that weathering typically happens is along the wheels. So typically you'll see splashed zones that I like to call them, or along the frame. This is because, as I said, dust and dirt get kicked up, water collects towards down to the bottom, so along the running rails of the doors, and really that's where you would predominantly see it. Taking a second and looking at a steam locomotive, this is a Reading T1 from Lionel in 1989 that actually turned out to be my first item to actually weather. And as you can see, this is drastically has more details on it and a little bit more areas to add more weathering to. So in this case, the wheels are highly weathered with a bit of white here and there, such as the trailing truck. That being a raised area closest to the ground, it has a lot more white. And the white itself is, as I said, to bring out more of the hidden details that are covered up by the base coat brown, but moreover to also show it has been more worn. If you look at photos of actual steam locomotives, typically you'll see the wheels, the cylinders, the firebox, and the base of the cab, as well as the trailing trucks, completely or almost white, and that being due to dirt being picked up, steam, soot, and other grimy stuff collecting onto the side of the wheels because there were compressed grease inside of the axles. But for other details besides making it look dusty, I've also added spillage. So these are prominent areas where a steam locomotive may have a leaky bushing. In this case, this is the throttle linkage, so I put steam coming off of it, or even a leaking pipe around the top of the cylinder, leaking down onto the side of the cylinders themselves. In this case, I was a little bit eased up with it, but as you can see, I did the safety valves, the dynamo, and in this case, if you wanted to really make it look distressed, you could add more white streaming, such as around the dynamo coming down, the safety valves, again here on the valves, the whistle, the stack, anywhere that you wanted. And another prominent area that you can use black paint for to really distress your locomotive, specifically steam if it's a coal burner, is black. Since locomotives typically in the United States burned not the highest quality of coal as considered in Britain, they would shoot out a lot of black smoke. And if you have a lot of tunnels on your layout, then it would collect onto the roofs of your locomotive. So in this case, painting the upper portion of the locomotive black, giving it a more distressed look. But with that, let's go ahead and move back to our test car and actually get to weathering. Alrighty, let's get into the fun part and actually go ahead and weather this car. Now, as I stated, I use the dry brush weathering. Dry brushing is typically used when trying to add more raised detail to an object. I've seen it many times on stonework where you're just lightly adding a nice little layer of white paint to give a little bit more detail to the surface, and also to a tunnel portal to make the raised areas more pronounced. In my case, I took it a step forward, and instead of just only highlighting certain areas on a car, instead I do the whole thing. So basically, I dipped my brush inside the desired paint. What I use first is the brown paint. Since that is going to be our base paint, that is what I use first. And then I wipe most of it off on a side piece of paper towel. This allows me to control how much paint is on my brush itself, and also allow me to keep a collection over here and have my paintbrush primed when I need to use it. In this case, since the brush is right now very dry, it's going to take a minute to get it really primed to where I like it, but in this case, it'll just be fine and it'll get better over time. So with a bit of paint on my brush, I get most of it wiped off, do another wipe, and then get straight to it. I typically start with the trucks, since the trucks themselves or the wheel frames themselves are very easy, and I just go around and give it a nice base coat of the brown. Now, the more coats you add, the more weathered it will look. In this case, if you just wanted to give it a very light weathering, make it seem and appear it's just been recently through a wash, or it's been a brand new car and it's just recently gone onto the road, it's been a few months, and it's just getting ever so lightly dirty, then you can just go and put a few layers of it on there. But basically, you continue this process however many times you want, And since it's an acrylic paint, and this version really dries very quickly, so you can do multiple layers very quickly in this case. And it doesn't matter if the previous layer accidentally comes back up, which it is prone to happen because the wet paint sticks to the not completely dried paint. It's no big deal. This is weathering. Weather doesn't matter what happens. It happens randomly. It just so happens to happen in certain places, and that's all we're doing. We're trying to imitate that uncontrolled feeling. So doing the trucks themselves first and also doing a base paint really gives you an idea of how you can layer it forward. In this case, after I give the truck side frames a good few coats of the brown, depending on how I want this car to be weathered. If I really want it weathered, it'll be really, really pronounced. Or if I want it light, then I'll only do, say, 2 or 3 coats. But after I go and do this initial layer on all over the car, I'll then move over to highlights. Highlighting would include using the black paint next and then the white. The black paint you don't have to use. I just use it because it creates sooty looks of coal-burning steam locomotives. And if you've seen my layout tour video, I have a lot of tunnels on my layout. As a result, soot's going to be everywhere, coal dust is going to be everywhere, so my cars are going to be covered in it. So really, now we've got a good base for the trucks themselves. I typically don't paint the wheels because they're already not well seen, especially on these semi-scale cars. And speaking of semi-scale, you don't have to weather just your semi-scale cars. I just weather my semi-scale cars as a cheap way to learn how to weather, and also I'm not going to cry about it, but you can also weather your scale locomotives and rolling stock. As you've seen in my video, multiple videos as I actually should say, I have weathered a Legacy H10 from Lionel, and that model was the first scale model that I actually went ahead and weathered. And did I intend to weather it? No, but I got the weathering craze, so I went ahead and did it. And that is something you're also going to find out. Once you get to start weathering, you're going to be like, oh goodness, all my other cars look oh so clean. Now I got to weather everything I have in my collection. So I would suggest pick your cheapest car. Whatever that may be, in this case, this is a car from 1992. So end of the Richard Kuhn, well, mid to late Richard Kuhn era, or even MPC cars. Dime a dozen, get them very cheap, $5 to $1 at a local train show, or even at a garage sale. Start off small and eventually work up till you're comfortable. But enough of that, let's get on to the body itself while we let the trucks dry. So keeping with our brown base paint, this is where the weathering can get a bit daunting, and the fact that a lot of people don't realize how or understand how to approach this. In this case, where I start is where dirt would naturally collect. So in this case, around the trucks. So let's start over here on the right hand side and just start moving it back and forth. And it looks like I need to get a little bit more paint. There we go. And as you can see, the silver really shows up, brings out the brown, and as you can see, it's starting to dull a bit. And really, this area, arched area on either side, is what I call the weathering zone. The weathering zone is basically where most movement and objects, where the wheels kick up the dirt. Now, as we move further, this is where more of the different kind of styles you want to have. If you want to have a heavily weathered version of a car, then you can go and put multiple layers on your car to a point where you can nearly see the lettering of the road name on the side of your car. In this case, I'll show you both. How I have lightly weathered a car, and also how I made this car into a very deep weather, which I prefer because it is the easiest, but also moreover, it fits the best in my railroad. So essentially, we're just putting a few layers at a time, changing the color of the silver base and making it look rusty. And you can also choose a different type of base paint as well. I just like an earth tone brown, as it is a well-rounded base color to make a boxcar look rusty. It makes it look dirty, but you can also use more like of a gray if you wanted to. If you have a railroad that is more, say, in the Midwest, where caliche and lighter stone, powder-like stone, is typical to be used on for ballast and whatnot. And really, a lot of times, if you wanted to get picky, then decide what kind of railroad region you want to run. That is a lot of times the biggest key to deciding what kind of weathering job you want to have. And probably one of the easiest, because what you're trying to do on any layout is recreate something from real life or something from your imagination. A lot of times people build a mountain, so you got to have tunnels, or you have trains go around the mountain, or even have a large prairie with farm fields and whatnot. But really, if you do choose a specific region that has certain territories and natural resources that are used on said railroad, then you can go further and make your cars look whatever you would like them to be. In my case, it's deep with a lot of moisture, high humidity, so these cars are going to rust a lot. Tunnels, okay, it's going to be dirty with coal dust on top of the roofs, maybe on the side since there is a coal mine. So really, if you wanted to get deep into it, you can make your cars whatever you want them to be, because based on the region, or you can just go and free-for-all it, like I kind of do at times, and go hog wild. You can't go wrong with weathering, but in this case, with this style, you can easily fix your mistake, because simply say I made this panel too dark, all I can do instead of it being permanent, say with a airbrush or some type of permanent chalk, all I got to do is dip a paper towel into some water, rub it off, let it dry, and start over. That is the beauty of dry brush weathering with acrylic paints, because you can easily go and fix your mistakes. Now, when you are done with your boxcar or locomotive, you do have to go and spray it with a matte clear coat in order for the paint to stay, especially on locomotives that you handle very often, because your fingers are going to start rubbing the paint off and going to have the normal paint show up through the new weathered paint that you've put onto your model. As a result, I use, like I said, just some type of Rust-Oleum product, a matte clear finish, and that allows the product to be permanent onto the car itself. However, most of the rolling stock that I have not clear coated them because I don't handle them very often and they haven't started chipping away anyway. So if I wanted to wipe down a car and start over, fine, that will work. So getting back to our progress, here you can see I have weathered the weathering zone. In this case, this being a double door boxcar, the left side had more panel space than the right side. And I also did the extra detail underneath the railing. The railings on these boxcars I have found out to be a little bit finicky when it came to applying paint because they have a smooth surface. So if you wanted to, you could even get some light sandpaper and rough up the metal itself so that the paint could adhere to it better. But let's get into the side panels themselves. So let me get some more paint onto my brush, do that technique a little bit, and let's talk about light weathering. So really, if you were going to do light weathering, the heaviest areas at most would be the weathering zones. The areas around the trucks, a little bit underneath the underframe, and that be it. Towards the top, you get into more of rain porridge and maybe even some more heavier rusting. In this case, if it was just only rain, all you would do is cover the raised areas. So in this case, all I do is brush over the rivets. Since the rivets are on most boxcars are the only raised areas on a boxcar because we have these single panels, I typically just go over like so. Now, this doesn't have to be perfect because this being the base coat, it's just to give it the main area of looking for the highlights to then come back through and give more specific details. In this case, the white paint won't go all the way down, and it will represent some type of water spillage that is collected over the roof. So say in this case there are spillways on the roofs, there would be little white streaks coming down off of them over the top parts of the rivets. But since this is, say, a boxcar that has been out on the rails for a few months, it will have minimal rust along the rivets since that's where the water has collected, and eventually it will reach the very bottom. So in this case, the base paint will go all the way down to the bottom. And it also doesn't matter if your brush goes over the rivets. It doesn't have to be directly on top, and it doesn't have to be square in between the rivet line. It can go over because as the rivets themselves start to rust, so do the panels thus next to it. And also don't be afraid to cover up any of the lettering. This is all natural. When metal starts to oxidize, it eats and does whatever it wants to do. So weathering is, people think weathering is a hard job, but if you look at enough photos, get a technique that you like. In this case, I really like doing dry brush weathering because it's so easy, so well controlled. You don't need any kind of expensive equipment like a compressor, a booth, the special paints that it takes, all that stuff. Instead, all you need is $15 of acrylic worth of acrylic paint, or probably actually less than that, some cheap brushes, variety of brushes like this, a glass of water to wash your brushes, and then some paper towels. That's all you need. It's really simple and I really like it. But the point is that weathering, though people think it is a daunting task because it's so permanent, which it is, it doesn't have to be. If once you get started and you get a designated idea and plan, or in some cases look at a photo, find a photo of the real thing that you like the most and you want to replicate it or replicate certain aspects of it, just pull it up right beside you. Put some music on, get your brushes out or whatever technique you like, and just go after it. It really doesn't matter. And if somebody goes and says, oh, this is not how it's meant to be, you can go and do it two ways. Take their advice and run with it, which oftentimes you should take it. I mean, that's why you're watching this video here. Or what you can also do is just take the advice, continue with what you already know, apply it. If it works, it works. But if it doesn't, then okay, go back to what you're used to. And it's no big deal. It's nothing detrimental. It's not life or death. It's just simply sitting down, relaxing, and enjoying your models. And weathering really is something fun to do, and I think a lot of people in this hobby miss out on, not because it is adding detail to your model, but because it's really honestly relaxing. Like, there are probably many people out there who want to learn how to paint, but in reality they can't because they don't have the skill level to do it. Well, this doesn't take any skill. I just eventually just took a boxcar one evening, saw I had these paints, and started painting away. It just took me some time and practice to get to it, and that's what you got to put into it, the effort and willingness and patience to go and weather your cars and whatnot. But it really is so simple. Like, as you see here, I've already done 3 bands in less than 5 minutes. Very simple. So enough of that jabbering. Let's continue with the weathering process itself. So as you can see, I'm weathering the raised spots themselves. Messy, but it's going to be messy. And once you get this done, or at least you get to a point where you're happy with it, you're faced with whether you want to continue to add more layers to an area and make it more profound. And that's really what's nice about dry brush weathering. You can add multiple layers, as many layers as you want, and make it more profound, take it away, and if it's too much, wipe it off with a wet rag and start over. That is just the beauty of it. Like so. And as you can see with my technique, I've got 2 piles starting. Sometimes once you get the paper towel really wet, all you gotta do is just wipe your brush over the paper towel itself, and that has enough accumulated paint to just hold on to it and give you enough back onto the brush that it's just the right layer to then press it down onto the car. And I like to go in one direction when it comes to weathering itself. As you see, I'm going in an up and down pattern with the grain of the brush itself. So it's at an angle, so I'm going and pressing down and going down with the angle. Up and down with the same, turn the brush, go up, turn the brush, go down. And that allows these brush strokes to blend in with the body itself, and you don't end up getting brush strokes that can be visible after you spray the boxcar or locomotive, whatever you're weathering, onto it. And in that case, I put a little bit too much, didn't brush off enough paint off my brush, which that is perfectly fine. Because then you can go and use it for the next row right over. Or say, since this area doesn't have any covering from the railing up top, makes sense for the rain to go and come down over it. So with the rivets all done, we then come to the next step, and that being ladders, grab irons, and a bit of the paneling itself. The ladders themselves, so think rationally. How I think about the ladders themselves is rationally, and that is, okay, they're going to be rusty on the back, but not as much. In this case, this is a model where the ladders are molded into the side, but in a scale model, this would be raised and there would be a space behind it. So it would be an area that would end up being rusty, but the grab irons on the side would probably be rusty too, but the foot pegs themselves. The foot pegs themselves are going to be pretty well polished if you're going to have crew members go up and down this very often. As a result, that's where the white paint will come in. The white paint is meant to show more distress and wear. The brown is meant to be the initial rust. It's going to be the sloppy stuff, whereas the white paint is meant to be the detail. So in my case, as you saw, I got the back panels a light dusting where it's kind of towards the bottom and not up in the top. And I've also gone ahead and gave the sides a light dusting, so to speak, as well on that sidewall. Yeah, there we go. And you can also take a finger and just wipe it off just slightly like that, and it works just fine. For the paneling, so besides the weather zone, you also got to think about where the rain is going to be collecting, and that's going to be up top. So in this case, if you want to do light weathering, you can just go and simply produce more distress along the side of the rivets, maybe a little bit more on the side like so, and bring it down along the side of the rust, and leave kind of the middle a little open to give it that more weathered look. The rust hasn't completely taken over just quite yet. It hasn't gone down all the way. And when it comes to the paneling as well, to blend the paint together, I first start with the initial strokes going down and then mix it all up by going side to side. It blends the paint together and allows it to not look so much of a brush stroke. And that's why a lot of people also like airbrush weathering, because you don't get the brush strokes. It's a lot quicker, but the downside is you have to pay a lot up front for the equipment. And it doesn't have to be perfect either. You can think of it, with weathering, you can either think of it very critically, be extremely picky, like I've seen some modelers be so picky about the type of water that was used to wash their locomotives and that has dried onto them as a result of the climate of the region, that they only used specific paints to go and techniques to make it look as real as it could be. But as you can see here on the paneling, I'm just free-flowing with it. It doesn't matter if it's up and down, left or right. Just really need to get a standard base stroke on it. And as you can see, it's heavier on the top. Since we got no railing, it's going to be heavier on the top. Droops downwards, but not completely heavy down at the bottom. Get some more paint. And right there. Okay, this is a good time to show you what I meant by taking a wet paper towel and dipping it in water and cleaning it off. So here, this is a heavy splotch, so I didn't wipe off enough of the paint off of my brush, and instead it accumulated towards the tip, and I got a little too much, got a little carried away. And since it's acrylic, voila. Now we've got a boxcar that is perfectly almost clean in this area. So I'll just wipe it off, dab it off. There we go. And we could start all over again. So this time I'll make sure I get a little bit less off my brush. And there we go. Like new. Or old in this case. And we'll do some towards underneath the railing as well and make the boxcar look even for this example's case. Lighter on the bottom, heavier on the top. There we go. And sometimes if you wanted to, you can also use a clear coat that has a glossy finish. Now, that would be typically for, say, a project that has ice. Like in November of last year, I produced a weathered Polar Express from a Lion Chief Plus set that my cousin gave me. And that I sprayed with a glossy finish. That being because, well, I was trying to imitate ice, and ice being wet. Oops, got too much paint on my brush. Since that's imitating ice on the side of the locomotive and snow accumulation, I gave it a shiny finish. But for most cases, I would use a matte finish, so it's not shiny, because we're not trying to make these be shiny. What we're trying to do is make them dirty. If we wanted something shiny, we'll just go down to the hobby shop, get a brand new model, and not even touch it with a paintbrush, not even get close with a paintbrush, and that's perfectly fine. In this case, I'm making the panels just a little bit darker than I had expected, but that's okay, and that's what happens with weathering. If you feel like you made too big of a mistake, then you can go and get the wet paper towel out, wash it off, start over, and voila, you're back to square one, which is no big deal whatsoever. In this case, all you can do, if you didn't want to go and rub all this off, which in this case I won't, because what I'll demonstrate is the layering technique of this method. So the rust along the rivets kind of blended in with the main panels, as you saw. So what you can do to get that rust back and more pronounced, as we wanted it earlier, is just go back through with another layer of the brown paint, like so, from earlier, and voila, they are more pronounced, making them, showing them that they are the main source area for the rust that is collected, streaking down and rusting the metal away. Forgot that area. Okay. So the car now is looking pretty good. And if you wanted to, this is where you could stop. You can actually just do this one base layer, call it good, and be all right. However, what I like to do is add just a wee bit more detail. In this case, the white. So let me go ahead and do the white. So let me stick my brush in there for now, let it wash just for a little bit, and let's get into the white. So, and also if you wanted to, you can use a different paper towel for this, but for this example's purpose, we'll just leave it be. And for the white, should I use the white one? No. Actually, yes. So for the white, we aren't trying to cover such a wide area of space on the car. All we're doing is trying to add little minute details. The technique's still the same, but the tools are just a little bit different. So in this case, I'll be using a smaller headed paintbrush. Just lightly dip, get that primed, rub it around on your brush, wipe it off, and again, starting from the bottom and working up to the top. So in this case, I just lightly brush over the raised areas of the car. And because the white paint acts as a highlighter, it really, if you get enough paint on your brush, that's all that's going to show. So here you can see underneath the roller bearing journal, there's a flat area. But the white paint isn't showing up on that white area. Instead, it's getting the edges, that's what we want. We want those exposed areas of wear showing up. So the edges of the frames themselves, the springs in the middle, the holes, the weight holes, everything. That's where it needs to be. Let's get a little bit more paint because it's going to be a little harder to get a unprimed paintbrush to get the paint initially on your first run. And with this, the stroking doesn't really matter. In some cases, you have to go up and down. A lot of times, you got to go left and right. Just depends on how much paint you want the product to be exposed to. So, get a little bit more paint. And as you can see, the base brown still shows up. We got that. But now we're making it look a little bit more pronounced with the wear and tear by adding prominent points showing up. So this is a light weathering, what I would consider a light weathered truck. So let's go with these, move over to the second one and do the same thing to it. Let's see, yeah, I got enough paint on that. And there we go. So the truck's really nothing much. Getting onto the body, it gets a little bit more interesting. So, like I said earlier, an area that I would like to cover is the ladders. Not the side parts, but the steps themselves, because that is where a person's foot's going to be, and it's going to get rubbed, the rust's going to get rubbed off, whatnot, and it just end up not being there and be bare metal, but smooth bare metal because you're constantly moving up and down. Same with the grab irons over, or stanchions over here. Just add a little white. And then also add a little bit of white coming down. And then I'm going to need a little bit more paint for this one. Add a little white water streak marks. And that's the other thing. If you didn't want to have 3 basic element colors, you can also mix it up. Like, again, If your territory that your layout is based out of, it may have different colored water where it stains on the cars. It may have different type of dirt, color, tone, whatnot. And it may also have just different elements. So as a result, you can have different colored paint. I just use these 3 types of paint because they're work really well together. They make pretty darn good results, and also that is pretty much what I wanted to model with these cars. And they're also a good, well-rounded beginning style of weathering colors as well. And it doesn't have to be heavy. The brown color is going to make the white pop out a little bit more than you may want to. In this case, you have to look at the car just right in the light, but it works out just fine. You just lightly brush it on. They could be different lengths, whatnot. In this case, just dripping off of the roof themselves, just over years and years of use, and the water just eventually coming down and streaking. Say this was just a recent thunderstorm, summer thunderstorm, and the next day was sunny and hot, so the water that is collected onto the car itself dried up. And that's pretty much it. The car itself is pretty much done on the side, besides the doors, which kind of ran out of time for this, but that's what light weathering looks like. Just simply adding multiple layers to an area, in this case predominantly around the rivets, and then later adding details to the side. If you wanted to add coal dust, take the same brush that you're using for your white, so let me wash that off. And add little speckles of coal dust here and there. So do dry brush. And again, since this will be on the roof, as you can see here, that's where I'll do it. So you just basically, well, if I could paint on it, that'd be workout. You just basically wipe it onto the roofs themselves. I like to blacken my roofs very darkly since I have tunnels, but it could just be whatever you want. If it's a steam locomotive, yeah, the top of the boiler is going to have a lot of this coal dust because it's going to accumulate on top of the boiler from tunnels, whatnot. In some instances, you kind of have to swirl your paintbrush to do this. In this case, I'm only doing the upper portion of the car because that's kind of where smoke coming down is going to hit the roof first, then eventually dissipate as it gets farther and farther down to the bottom of the car. So get that swirling in there just a little bit, and it makes it a little bit more dirty. Now on the flip side, if you wanted a car that is heavily weathered, heavily rusted, it hasn't been serviced in who knows how many years, then this would be your end result. Just pretty much completely wiped out brown, heavy base, multiple layers of the brown base, heavy black, not a lot of white because it's really just rusted out and that's it. Pretty much weathering, as I said, could just be whatever you want. It could be light, it could be heavy, or it could just simply just be a puff of dust up in your face. That is all you can have it to be. Well, that's pretty much it for my tutorial on how to weather your rolling stock or even locomotives. Hopefully I've covered everything to get you started on this new venture of hobbying. It's really kind of a dying part of the hobby that isn't pursued very often by newcomers because of the daunting thought that you can't stop once you get started. However, with dry brush weathering with acrylic paints that you can simply buy for $5 at a local hobby shop, I mean even for a big bottle, you can really get started and get into a part of the hobby that really is overlooked. Overall, if you have any questions, concerns, or even any types of tips for me to make my weathering even better, put them down in the comments section and I'll read them and hopefully give you some tips of my own and get you started on your way of weathering your models. Again, this doesn't have to be put in O scale. It could be HO, N, G scale, any type you want. This was just the size I used, and that's what I run. Anyway, thank you very much for clicking on this video, watching it to the very end, and while you're at it, please do click on the subscribe button so that you don't miss any future videos that I produce, and also hit that like button to let me know that you actually enjoyed this video. But anyway, my name is Trainmaster04, and I'll be seeing you next time.